really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash and we are here kicking off the third season of this fantastic episode that I continue to enjoy to produce and I hope you enjoy listening to. I hope you had a good summer and you spent some time listening to these specially edited episodes that were put together by our wonderful editor, Sammy Prouty, juxtaposing two episodes selected from our past and putting them together in a manner that they talk to each other. I thought those conjunctions were extremely successful and I hope you enjoyed them as well. Today, to start off our new season, I am talking to my good old friend Peter Scriver, who is a professor of architecture at the University of Adelaide in Australia. He's one of the established scholars of South Asian architecture and history. And today I am talking to him about how he became a scholar of Indian architectural history, what his imperatives were, what his journey was, and how he came to be writing about architectural history in a very particular way. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Here we go. Yet once again, Peter, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Happy to be here.
So, Peter, we've been friends now for about 4 decades and followed as historians the story of the architecture of India from, I don't know, somewhere in the early 80s until this present day when it seems like both of us are still writing about modern Indian architecture, colonial Indian architecture, colonial modernism, and so on. Now you're from Canada, from I think, Montreal, I suppose.
That's correct. Yes.
Although I know you were, I think, born in London. But so, you know, it's a long way from Canada, or I suppose from London. But can you tell us briefly about how you got invested in India? What fascinated you to sort of work on Indian architecture?
Well, I think it's a slightly complicated story, as we discovered in a recent conversation you and I had, that has multiple layers. The one hook, the most obvious hook, was an opportunity as a youth, as an 18-year-old. Literally, the year I was intending to begin architecture studies, I had a chance, an unexpected chance, to take a year out and go with a Canadian aid involved organization,
Yeah.
quasi-governmental organization, that gave me a chance to be a volunteer working in community development projects, in this case in Sri Lanka.
Oh,
And
and
it
you just
was,
hopped across to India
well,
from there?
yes, it was such a positive and fascinating experience for a young adult that I was at that time, that really.
What made it so positive for a young adult? Like, what do you have, like a evocative memory that just sort of jumps out and said, "Yeah, I suddenly sort of was drawn to India from at that moment."
Uh, it, I think it was the desire. It was the late 1970s, as a child of the 60s, who really was invested in this idea that we were becoming one world. Here I'd had a chance to come from a very privileged place on the planet to go in the context we were working in Sri Lanka. It was truly village level.
So it's this idea of the global village, yes?
Yeah. Yes, in an interesting way. I think that term was something I discovered in my intellectual life slightly later, but I realized I'd been living that for since my childhood. In fact, I'd really wanted to go on this experience because I had I'd experienced the world on my doorstep in a sense when I was a kid, and the World Exposition of 1967 came to
Of course,
Montreal.
yes, yeah.
Yes, and arguably that's when I decided, or I first had the idea that maybe architecture was was something that would be really cool to
Uh-huh.
become in my adult life. And it was on the way to becoming that, really to fulfilling that a decade later, that I had the chance to go and experience the world. I'd seen the pavilion of Sri Lanka, I'd seen India's pavilion at Expo, I'd seen many other seemingly exotic, far distant places in the world that someday I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful to go to? But it also imbibed that idea that was very much a part of that late 60s moment through the 70s in particular, in which Canada was very much involved as this sort of second tier, developed world state that was leading the peaceful approach to world development. It wasn't a superpower, but it had this sort of this idea. It invented peacekeeping, for instance. And it was very
So
much
you're talking about, the US using in many ways the Ford Foundation and the Peace Corps to almost infiltrate as a CIA infiltration system.
well, yeah, and all that would come in that sort of cynical sophistication of the young sort of critical academic. But at this point,
Yeah,
I was a naive believer that the Canadian version of the Peace Corps was a wonderful thing.
yeah, yeah.
It was actually in the context of doing that not surprisingly my mentors, the group leaders and such, were actually young university students who were very politicized and were teaching us to be skeptical about our own agency and to think critically about the development of underdevelopment and all these ideas that became very central to my thinking as an early career academic. I was really in a classic culture shock sort of haze for several days when I really just had to sleep and process things, and it was hard to get to grips with it. But then I woke up several days into this Sri Lankan experience, and we'd been taken to an agricultural college in the center of the country, and we were told today we're going to plant rice. It was like we'd been inducted into the sort of Chinese
You
youth
were
corps.
planting rice.
Yes, this is how we were received. Was we were collaborating with what was called the National Youth Service Corps of Sri Lanka, which was a product of the Bandaranaika era. It was very much a socialist youth service scheme, and
Uh-huh.
it was aimed at sort of idle village youth to get them involved in building in nation building,
I
and, and
see.
and and we were 50-50 exchange group. We'd already spent several months in Canada with the same counterparts. So we knew each other well, and now we arrived. They're very excited to have us in their country, and we went to these villages that they didn't come from either. They'd come from other villages. We were sent to
Uh-huh.
a new place where we were to join the local force, and there we were at 7 in the morning, saluting the Sri Lankan flag. And they were sort of nobly trying to sing the Canadian anthem as well as we raised the Canadian flag on the site of these job sites, and trooped into the forest to go and build roads. It was a truly intoxicating, as I say, intoxicating spirit.
I,
But it
I
became
don't know, Peter. You're not selling it to me. I mean, it's
it.
there.
Yeah, it's like work camp. I mean, this was taking one out of by choice, by volunteering, out of one's easy norm. I was supposed to be starting my studies at McGill in architecture and
Yeah.
being a college student in a normal North American way, and I'd chosen not to do that. I'd chosen to go and wear a sarong, and yes, we began by planting rice. That was our induction to put in the new rice and learn how paddies worked, etc. And then they took us to our villages and we started building roads.
Okay.
And yes, by choice, not
Okay.
by penal
Not
sentence.
not by fiat.
But this is very important. Okay, you asked your
Yeah.
question. Yeah. The Of course India comes in between for 6 months, which
Yeah.
is a hugely important experience. So I have this half year or so of village life, learning another language, living off the grid. Literally, these villages were not electrified.
Yeah.
We lived the life and rhythm of the day. We were up at the crack of dawn, and then we retired in the heat of the day and slept in the afternoon, and then went and socialized and drank tea with villagers. And we're part of this village for in a way. We so we believed for a period of time, which was truly idyllic in many ways.
So
And then
is that a badge of honor for you?
a, a badge of honor is probably not what I would say, but it was a great privilege. I see that it
Yes,
was a
yes,
privilege.
privilege. Yes.
Yeah, a privilege to have had that opportunity to be received so warmly and to have, thought that one was serving. I went back years later, and of
Uh-huh.
course the roads that we had made had just disappeared back into the jungle, and it hadn't become real
Yeah.
development. But it was a moment of engagement that was in a bubble of time when these sort of good actions and goodwill and such did
Meant
seem to
something. They
mean
were
something.
probably real. Yeah.
It certainly meant something for me, but that's the thing, that it was
No,
the
there was. I mean, Peter, I would argue that there was, however naive and utopian, there was I would describe modernist ethos that really thought there could be sort of a global exchange, global communication, global citizenship, and truly a collaborative and a somewhat global village family oriented ethos to it. I mean, it didn't turn out that way, but
Mhm.
there certainly was a moment that truly believed that. Would you say so?
Absolutely, and now you've brought that term "global village" into our conversation,
Mm.
which again was something that I began to realize was in the discourse when I became a university student, and perhaps even beyond when I became a research student. But I recognized that was the idea that was manifest in my childhood when I encountered Expo '67 in Montreal, where I grew up, which was the kind of the overture to this desire to see the world,
Hmm.
and perhaps, among other things, the invitation to later on to study architecture, and not surprisingly, perhaps to do it in my own hometown at McGill, where so many of the amazing pavilions that were built at Montreal and that gained international um, notoriety and inspiration were actually designed. So, of course, Safdie had been a student at McGill, and his habitat was something that I saw as an 8-year-old, and so I went, and everybody said, like, wow, and I said, wow, that's building the future. That's something. This notion of
Yeah,
habitat.
yeah.
That's what architects
Habitat.
do.
Yes, yes.
And in a certain sense, I was going to work on the habitat of the developing world as an 18-year-old. 10 years later, uh, as an overture to my architectural education, which began a little less than a year later when I returned by way of India
To
to
McGill.
begin my studies at McGill.
So let's turn to Vikram Bhatt and
Hmm.
your journey back to India. And I want to get to your famous co-writing of the book that really introduced me to you,
Mm.
which is the After the Masters book. Uh, so how did you end up writing that book? I think that time you were still finishing up as a student at McGill, weren't you?
Okay, well, this is the way it worked. I returned from India and Pakistan and Nepal and such. I'd seen the rest of South Asia on the way back from Sri Lanka. Had my last stop had been Chandigarh.
Yeah.
I entered my class in McGill, and it wasn't actually till my later that same year that I noticed there were some of these Indian graduate students around the place that looked like familiar faces to me, because I'd just returned from that part of the world. I was very empathetic with senior colleagues in this case from that part of the world, and Vikram Bhatt turned out to be one of these graduate faces in the woodwork at McGill. I learned later that he'd already done his master's course there, and he was junior faculty now. And so we developed a friendship through my undergraduate years. And as I came towards my graduation sometime later, we were fast friends, I guess, by then, and he'd become quite aware of my interest in returning to Asia. That was really my mission. I'd had this development experience, and that was the sort of architecture which I now was aware that he and his graduate program were deeply invested in. The McGill minimum cost housing
Uh-huh.
group was quite a leading group in the research field globally at that time. And this, of course, was the academic collaborative face of Doshi's Vastu Shilpa Foundation in Ahmedabad. all of which
So,
I'd
and
now
this
learned
was
about.
mid 80s, yes?
Well, I finished, yeah, 84
No,
was
yeah, 84, yeah.
I graduated.
So you went to Ahmedabad and you with Vikram Bhatt and in collaboration with Doshi. How did you were there doing work on housing? How did that result a book in architectural history?
Well, again, the short version is like that. In the end, I'd end up working with Doshi's partner of the time, with Joseph Stein
Yeah.
and J.R. Bala in Delhi for about half a year.
What was that like before we get to the book? I mean, what
Yeah.
was it like to work for Stein?
I mean, I regard certainly him as one of my true mentors.
Yeah.
Looking back,
What was the office ethos like at that time?
well, I, as you would be aware, I wrote about it later on, and I called it upstairs, downstairs. I used the reference to the kind of the British class culture of of the great house, where I was privileged to be inducted into the upstairs English-speaking professional crew, who of course were uh, Stein's circle of young architects and proteges.
How big was that circle?
Well, it was the back of the office. There were maybe 8 or 10 of us in that part of the office, and I
And
don't know.
downstairs?
And then downstairs there was 15 to 20 others who were the in-house engineers, the clerks of works, the
Yeah, yeah.
and drivers and other support people who made this office work and really, literally grounded it. Stein was truly a paragon of the benign, the beautiful face of regional modernity. His idea, his ideal of modern design and architecture was the quintessential form following need and purpose intimately and passionately designed to context.
What was he like as a person to work with for you?
He was an extremely gentle, soft-spoken, well, as I use that word, paragon of the architect as a passionate individual. He loved
Hmm.
music. He loved
Was there
he.
music playing in the office all the time?
No, they didn't get played in the office, but I had the privilege of being like a regular dinner guest on a.
So he really took you under his wing.
He really did, and I would have these evening conversations on the veranda overlooking the zoo in Swinternagar.
Wow. Yeah,
Uh,
that's idyllic Delhi of the old.
so I have these wonderful memories of listening to old recordings of Jascha Heifetz playing Bach partitas and such that he would lovingly play out, scratching records, and we would just listen,
Just sit
to
and listen
to
quietly.
the hairs on the bow and such, and then in the background, the lions would have had their evening meal and would be grumbling. And we would be slowly sipping our whiskeys and sodas in a wonderful
Whiskey
uh,
and soda. Yes, of course.
old surviving sort of colonial moment on the veranda with no air conditioning, of course, just the wonderful feeling feeling the season, whatever it was,
Yeah, yeah.
living in balance with it. He always wore his
Did you
safari.
feel that it was a colonial moment, or did you
Well,
just feel it as a regional modernist moment?
I mean, it was in his mind absolutely the regional modernist moment.
No,
In
for
my
you,
mind,
for a young architect there. What?
I think you asked earlier on what the attraction was of India,
Yeah.
and it was this strange. For me, it's, and you know me a bit. It's a sort of this combination of this guilt and sentiment. I sort of said that there's something sentimentally sweet or attractive about this strange familiarity of a culture that I never knew directly, but is this sort of strange overlay of things familiar in a very different place, and the listening to Bach, something I was brought up with in the same sort of spirit of music appreciation in my own house, in this entirely other condition, is something that I found uh, terribly appealing, and yet
Not surreal like listening to Bach.
surreal, yes, and I guess seeing this man who, yes, we could criticize from outside, saying he was naive, he was living in this bubble,
No.
but he was the beautiful example of the believer that you could take this craft and this attitude towards design, and he did go as a Ford Foundation teacher in mid-career in the
Yeah, yeah.
1950s when he left an America that he was becoming disenchanted with, and he went to a place that inspired him profoundly and was encouraged to stay.
What a profound thing. Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. Yeah.
And the only sad thing is that in those conversations on that, on that veranda at that stage of his life, he was he was beginning to concede that the dream was cracking.
Was he jaded? Was he unhappy?
He was sad. He would say in those days when he built the international center in Delhi, you could do concrete with, it was a thing of beauty, and it was a piece of handcraft, and the contractors were so passionate to achieve the results that they clearly did. But then he would lament the fact that the current managers of the building didn't appreciate that.
I mean, those were also postmodern days, right? I mean,
Yeah.
postmodernism was in the appreciation of modern architecture was down in the dumps internationally.
Yeah, well, of course, it had a longer life, and with his partners like Doshi, he'd sort of managed to maintain the sort of glory streak of the.
I mean, though she had sort of gone postmodern by then, no?
He was declaring his new colors at that
Yeah,
moment, and of course, their relationship was evolving in a way that ultimately distanced each other.
fractured. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But okay, let's return to the book. Okay, after the Stein interlude,
yeah, yeah.
how did
Okay.
you end up writing this book?
The situation was that Vikram bought himself a sabbatical, significant money from the Canadian International Development Agency to do a comprehensive study of sites and service projects around all of India. It was now time to take stock of how self-build was actually working. And I've just had a conversation with this friend of mine, Bipin Shaw, the
Yeah, yeah,
publisher of
yeah.
Mapin, which was, the launching point of Shaw and Malika Sarabhai's project to have a series on contemporary Indian architecture. And they said, there's this complete void of of actual good quality books about it. Why don't you think about it? And Vikram grew up with Bipin in Bhavnagar. They were childhood friends.
Yeah,
It was just like from Vikram's point of view, who was coming to do the serious stuff, to look at
yeah,
at,
yeah. Look
at
at
what
housing. Who wants a
look at
history
look at
book? Yeah.
look at what we did. He says, it's not my thing, but yeah, let's have some fun. We'll go and talk to my classmates, and we'll go and talk to the uncles, uh, uh, Doshi and all his gang, and we'll see what they're up to. And but he was very conscious in his sort of cocky way of being now a kind of a legitimate outsider. That he had an external perspective that could give a critical edge to this type of coffee book enterprise, which neither of us was really, well, at least I certainly wasn't interested in doing a coffee book. I was already a bit of a snob, and a sense that because of my own indoctrination in real development and my return to India for noble purposes to be involved in in doing what I had intended to do, work on housing and stuff like that. I wasn't there for the postmodern sort of glitz, but it would be interesting, and it was certainly becoming interesting to look at India at that time, because it was neglected, but it was also turning a corner, and there was a lot of awareness coming to the new work of Riwal, for instance, the new work of Doshi, etc. So we thought, well, let's do that. But it was subsidized by the Canadian International Development Agency's funding to get Vikram and his assistant, who I became for a few months, around to these sites and service projects and adjacent informal settlements and such around the country, that we were looking at literally continuing their method of doing essentially graphic standards analyses of what had been the outcome. Really, real empirical work, just looking
But
at.
you ended up instead writing
Well, we did
a,
we did both,
a
which which
no,
which
but
is
what I'm saying is
yeah,
that,
yeah.
I'm sure you did important and critical work on the
Yeah.
housing, but the arrival of that book is what transformed, well, if not transformed, but was a landmark event in the sort of history writing
Yeah,
of modern Indian architecture. I
I guess
mean,
so. And again, consciously, it
I
wasn't
know,
certainly
no,
it
but
wasn't intended to be a history book, but this is where perhaps as I've written about recently, the historian inside me woke up. I remember sitting was just trying to write down the first drafts of things and figure out what the chapters would be, etc. And there was one moment it occurred to me that what we were going to call this book was the title that it now has. It was after the masters, because that was the constant thing was
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
the relationship with these great masters, and who was closer and who was not, and who was influenced and who wasn't by the styles of the greats. The more I'd been, and I was just trying to write, the necessary little short intro to say, well, India got started in 1947, and this was the scene, and Corb came, and blah blah blah. And, realized that I couldn't just recant that. What this double play, and it was like the double coding of this room after the Masters, that this colonial story was just looming underneath there, and no one had really looked at it,
I
which
mean,
was indeed.
in many ways, that is your singular, significant contribution to architectural historiography of South Asia,
Mm.
which is the attempt to look at architectural history not from this usual aesthetic interpretation angle, but sort of as underlying systemic transformations. I
I
mean,
mean, I would agree. I'm glad you see it that way. That's certainly what I would like to have recognized as perhaps the most important thing about what I've been trying to work on. I believe it's really important because it is
I mean,
systemic.
there's a
Yes.
sort of a structuralist Foucauldian kind of perspective to this.
Uh,
Is that true?
s- I mean, certainly, yeah. I mean, if Foucault is the label we'd put on it from our generation of authors. I came into doing my PhD at the point when his work was at the height of influence, and
So
uh,
you acknowledge him as a distinct influence
I
on
I
your
would
work?
I would, and I'm remembering that my own supervisor was dead set against that. So it was sort of my rebellious sort of uh, again double
Therefore, you had
play.
to do it. Yeah, no, of course.
Well, so the title of my thesis was rationalize, standardize, control.
Yeah, yeah.
but then he insisted on putting that the subtitle was this long thing about a cognitive historical study of whatever.
Okay, so we have done the After the Masters books. You co-edited a couple of books on colonial thinking.
Hmm.
Uh, and what are you working on now?
Well, I'm finishing a long-term project that I have been working on for several years, which uh, is reflects the fact that, of course, I'm now established, have been for over 2 decades, in 2.5 decades
Australia.
in Australia, which has, as you know, everything to do with you.
Don't
Strangely enough,
blame me.
uh, but that's another story.
Yeah, that's a different story. Let's
Um,
return to where you are. What you're
But
working on now.
what I have been working on is something I'm truly passionate about. It's interesting. Every once in a while, I realize I get going on something when it occurs to me in my gut rather than my head that is something I want to do.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Shortly after I arrived in Australia, and in Adelaide, where I lived, one of the first buildings that I really noticed of interest, now that I kind of was conscious of being a essentially historically engaged architectural scholar, was that there was a 19th century heritage listed mosque in
Huh.
in the very center of
All
Adelaide,
right.
and it's strikingly conspicuous for four very fine minarets
Yeah.
standing outside of the late 19th century residential fabric of the southwest corner of the central business district of the city. And I said, what is that doing here? And local colleagues said, "Oh, that's the Afghan mosque." I said, "Afghan mosque? Why is it called that? And why is it here?" And he said, "Oh, some camel drivers or something built that." Um, yeah, it's on the heritage list, and end of story. And I said, "Well, this is indeed rather intriguing." When a few years later, I was profoundly embarrassed by the fact that the Australian government was turning away Afghan refugees from
Right,
the
right,
the
right, right.
conflict as questionable new Australians with who'd
Yes.
arrived by boat who invaded our shores by boat illegally. And then were being put in internment camps in places in the center of the country that, as my research began to reveal, were settlements that actually existed as a result of these, indeed, these South Asian camel drivers who had opened up the actual interior of this very dry desert-like country to development in the 19th century. I realize this is a strange irony that these wastelands or these places of remove from urban Australia that illegals were being sent, illegal arrivals were being sent, were indeed places that existed because we'd had genuine um, persons from the same part of the world who'd made these places in the first place.
So this is an explicitly, politically motivated project for you. I mean, you want to,
Yeah, yes,
yeah,
my 1970s bleeding heart was rent open and bloody. My sanguine sort of sense of scholarly mission was excited by this. I wrote my first passionate piece back in 2003 or so, when this was still a very raw issue
uh,
in the country, and subsequently managed to get a significant grant from the
from the
Australian
same
system,
government that
from the
is
same
sent.
government. Interestingly, yeah, we pressed the right buttons somehow, in collaboration with a colleague from the South Australian Museum, a proper historian and anthropologist who works on primarily on European Aboriginal contact, but had a sort of an interesting side interest in these others who were part of the story in the background of the 19th century colonial history. And we're now finishing we need to finish the definitive publications that have come out
Mhm.
of really doing field work, where we've gone to many of these remote parts of Australia to observe what traces are there. I mean, ironically, this is a story about non-architecture. These guys left almost no traces. There was this conspicuous trace of an urban mosque, and there's one other very fascinating example in Perth, where this community of essentially peripatetic, mobile, itinerant laborers, indentured laborers who'd been recruited in the context of post-slavery economy of the British colonial world, the same system that sent masses of South Indians to Trinidad and to Fiji and other parts
Mhm.
of the British Empire. They managed to recruit Northwest Indian camel drivers, many of whom were of Afghan descent, but many others included Sikhs and Hindus and Baluchis and Sindhis, etc., who were good at handling camels, who came through Karachi primarily, but we now understand some other ports as well around the subcontinent to Australian ports, and made lives usually on 3-year intervals here in Australia that were largely on the trail, camping and carrying incredible loads to remote places. But here and there, they did take wives and did settle, and there are descendants that
Mm.
we've managed to connect with. And so our work is largely on the impact on settlement history, not so much on remaining buildings and such that we might say, there's clearly the trace of the northwest frontier in India,
Right, right.
in Australia. But here and there are actual that we have sort of fascinating archival photographs of mud mosques and tin mosques and other things on the frontier that were places of prayer, of course, and community for these traveling truckers, really, who made the developed country possible. So we're
Okay. Well,
writing
we
this
yeah.
social history, and
So we'll look forward to that book. But
yeah,
as we move towards the end part of
uh,
our conversation here,
yeah.
I want to come to this recent book that you co-authored with Amit Srivastav, who was on one of my earlier episodes,
Hmm.
on the history of modern architecture in India, with sort of like a more scholarly version of the your After the Masters book,
Hmm.
which is a fine book, part of that reaction series. And you have written a new history here now, which starts in colonial times and comes up to the present. Now, having written this new book on the history of the modern in India, What is your sense as a historian and as a contemporary thinker of the state of, let's say, architectural thinking and architectural discourse in India today?
Yes, this was the challenge of this book, was that I had to deal with that question, and write about India today. Very
Hmm.
much part of the mission of the commission of the that series, from whatever the past of the beginning of the modernist story to the present. Um, as others have written, and we could refer to Rahul Mehrotra's important book on architecture since the 90s.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I would agree. There's been this pluralization of the the reality of architectural production, and perhaps its perceived purpose in the contemporary society that India is today.
What does pluralization mean for you? I mean, I know Rahul's book and purpose, but
Mhm.
pluralization means like there are many different discourses. Is that what that means, or is there some uh, political agenda to this that you think is important?
Uh, I think we need to become political again, I guess, or at least reflect with a politically engaged mind to understand what our purpose might be as a discipline. I think it for those who know the story that you and I have written about before, and its long versions and such. There's this the sense that, and those who still survive to kind of hold the flame or remember what the mid the the nation building generation of the mid 20th century were engaged in. There was a sense that you know architecture was in that modernist sense that I think you and I kind of believe in. It really was uh, about not just building the nation, about building worlds.
Yes, but that modernism had a specific perspective. You are
Y-
saying that's all behind us, behind India, and it's all pluralized now.
Yeah, well, now the debate, if there is a debate, is about which world you care to invest in. The trope of the mid-century, the one that was manifested in those expos that was influential to me, uh, and that led to my sort of vocation in architecture, so to speak, was indeed inspired by this idea that there was a convergence. There was a possibility of building a better that would be welcoming and relevant to all. But
But
with
but
in
that's
our
not today. Yeah.
the modernism that someone like Joseph Stein manifested and mentored his interns and colleagues to understand. That certainly was the message I was seeking to experience, and such was that it would always be sensitive to the differences in the localities. There would be the commonality, but the scope for difference. And in the best of the late modernist work that Vikram Bhatt and I looked at in our early book and such, that was what we were celebrating too. I guess that common that sort of pair of possibilities of being um, distinctive yet robust and open um, a common global sort of humanist culture was something that we celebrated. I think this plurality now is its banal face, of course, is what we call economic globalization, which says, of course, that's exactly what it's all about: universal, systemic access of capital and technology and
Hmm.
ideas to every corner of the planet, to enable everybody to have their bite of the cherry or the apple, whatever we want to say, everyone to be part of the same thing if they so choose. But it's of course the banality we lament, and the homogeneity of that we lament, and the fact that no, that is as many of us would argue, so much more a neo-colonial system than the one that we were idealizing, perhaps. Of course, the modernist model we talked about was very clearly a system that could be neo-colonial and was in money, economic and industrial ways. But that sense of plurality that was possible earlier, it was more of sort of respect for difference, but yet the sort of lingua franca of having something in common, which among other things might be, an infrastructural and a spatial universality of sorts with
But that's
critical
out the
differences.
door now, is it not,
Yeah.
Peter? I mean,
Um,
modernism and its entire ethos in this
mm,
turn toward pluralism, if you like,
yeah.
is precisely what is sacrificed on the block.
Yeah, because it's become uh, about choice in the purest and most ideologically uh, transparent sort of market terms. Freedom of choice to consume and have whatever your capital can buy, which has no judgment really, which actually disdains um, notions of taste or judgment or
But,
uh,
but this is again your structuralist you that is sort of doing the critique of globalization. But let's just focus in for a moment on the critique of judgment and taste and aesthetics. I
mm,
mean, in this sort of plurality of, let's say, styles
mhm.
that is supported in India today, in the discourses of India, in the sort of the wake of the demise of modernism and even, yeah, postmodernism, it could easily and to certain extent seems to me to be a moment of uh, really kind of a directionless uh, chaos, if you like. I mean, it's not literally chaos, but it's like it seems like a moment of uncertainty to me. Like, well, don't really know what to do. Most people seem to want globalization and super malls. So the architectural establishment's response is what? Sustainability, and let's just try a whole bunch of new architectural idioms. Is that too cynical?
Well, it's cynical. I don't think it's necessarily incorrect. It, I'll revert to another term that certainly sticks firmly in my thinking, coming out of our generation of critical thought on this. Conspicuous consumption is what drives um, idea making, if there's any idea at all. Something that stands out, whatever it is. It may be. It used to be iconically uh, progressive things, but it can be equally iconic, neo-traditional or alternative things as well. It could be a super green building, it could be a super tall building, it could be a super non-modern building that has not an iota of steel or concrete in it, that is made out of remarkable innovation with ancient sort of stone carving techniques. All of these things are possible in India today. I mean, this is essentially what Rahul's parallel tracks of alternative manifestations of architectural production demonstrates. But I think it's what is problematic, where perhaps he wisely or cautiously does not tread too deeply in his own analyses of what's happening, his own description of what's happening is, of course, is what the implications of these investments mean in terms of fracturing.
What do you think? What is your last word on that?
Well, it's not I'm be the last person to have the last word on
No, no,
such
we're going to
things.
have to end the podcast soon. That's why I mean,
Well, I'll throw one other term in here. I've had a chance to think about this through something that Amat and I are trying to do creatively by collaborating and we've collaborated with each other. I spent a career collaborating with others to try to shake up my own thinking a bit. We've now, among other collaborations, we're working with some of our political science, political inquiry colleagues here in University of Adelaide, who are also India engaged, and we were invited to write about uh, the architectural or the representation of politics in a collective volume that's looking at it, at how politics is reflected in different disciplines. And so we were invited to write about politics, about architectural representation of politics in India
Hmm.
today. And we said, well,
What did you say?
let's speak to our political uh, our humanities colleagues in politics and see what how they think of architecture. And so we're co-writing this piece where they say, oh, well, it's obvious to us that we could talk analogically about political blocks of voters and followers of certain political ideals and such as like building blocks, and that the political process looks to articulate or disarticulate, these are their terms, these blocks. And so we've been writing, for instance, about the demolition of the campaign to demolish and save, etc.,
Yeah, yeah.
the halls of nation, which is really the main sort of discussion point amongst many of us these in recent years, around the bigger question of India's modern architectural heritage and what it represents in the political spectrum. But the way of talking about that building, and say comparing and contrasting it with the Ayodhya temple issue, two pregnant issues of where architecture seems to matter at a certain moment
Hmm.
in the broader cultural consciousness, where literally life and death, certainly for the buildings, but also for people, is brought to the fore by the political imagination, and what importance the common person puts upon these buildings. I mean, the irony is that, the unbuilt temple and the mosque in the place of it was the directly or indirectly the cause of thousands of deaths, and great passion and huge political and social energy invested in the idea of a building, and its rightful place on
Right,
the
right,
face of
right.
the earth.
Yeah, yeah.
A building that you and I maybe care about far more than the average person, which no longer exists. The Hall of Nations, a symbol of of the nation building, the very nation building that we've been talking about in
Do you
this interview.
lament it? What's your
Uh,
position on that?
well, I mean, I, like many others, spilt ink trying to save it at the nth hour by writing something that might be thought provoking. We did
Well,
a
that
piece
may be
for.
emotional. Retrospectively, what do you think?
Uh, well, I think we need to find out why that battle was lost. And ironically, in the efforts of the political, if we want to see it from that point of view, the political leaders of the moment to disarticulate uh, the association of uh, well, the elite. What our political friends tell us is very obvious. Is that what in destroying or building a case to destroy that building, the current powers that be were appropriating or rearticulating the voting bloc that in the past would have supported the nation building progressivist arguments of the other side, to their agenda of being the real nation builders. This, of course, was the agenda of the administration for the past term of election.
Mm.
Now it's not quite clear what it's going to be, since they've won in spite of not achieving those goals. That was the whole campaign during the period in which this building was destroyed, is that they're the real leaders of true progress. And of course, this outdated 1970s uh, image of a failed progressivist mission of a bankrupt previous administration was
So,
clearly not the symbol for
architecture
the
in the
future.
service of ideological myth making, it just
Yes,
continues. I mean,
but it's fascinating how the same political process can champion two completely different architectural projects with apparently completely opposite agendas, but manage to bring and reimagine, shift the entire imagination of the supporting the political base to a new agenda or to a different agenda, even at the expense of the icon of the previous agenda. So, I mean, I think this is fascinating. The fluidity we talk about, the uh,
Yeah,
the
I don't know
fluidity
if
of the mind.
it's the same agenda. It seems to me, you use it whichever way you want.
Mm,
I mean, it's using architecture completely superficially as a instrument of varnishing ideological
yeah.
processes
Well,
versus
we
a
can.
structuralist use of architecture as an infrastructure, as you talk about it, to
Mm.
sort of really construct the nation.
So this is in our book. We come up with the argument that there's a sort of tug and pull between the rhetorical and the rational sort of purposes to which architecture is put, and how it's embraced or championed. And yeah,
Right.
we look back over the 150 years or so that we look at, and we see that that's a constantly a tug and pull between, is it building bricks and mortar which are helping in a pragmatic and obvious and rational way to change the way we do things, or is it, it's inspiring a belief or ideas that are, in spite of what it actually does, it's much more powerful what it makes us think,
Okay.
or indeed does the daily practice that we no longer think consciously about, but actually our behavior that is dictated by the environment, does it actually shape our thinking in ways that we are beneficial or not? This is the flux and flow and tug and pull between these things that we talk about looking back.
Constant tug and pull, going back and forth.
So I think it's not really a different situation now. It's the same. Yeah, you're right.
So
It's
in that sense, it's the same situation.
yeah,
It's
same
constant tug and
difference.
same
same
old
same
wine, new
difference.
bottles. It's
That's right. Yeah.
anyway, Peter. It's been great having this conversation with you.
It
Uh,
it, it
Thank you
has.
so much for coming out on a Saturday morning to record this with me.
It has been a pleasure, and look forward to speaking again.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.